I was 3,000 feet up a mountainside in the Cascades, checking telemetry from the landslide monitoring sensors along the new rail corridor, when the text message finally punched through the spotty reception. Mike, it's over. My lawyers sent the papers to your office. Don't make this ugly. I've taken what's fair. Just like that. 15 years condensed into 21 words on a cracked iPhone screen. My name is Michael Turner, 46, a geotechnical engineer. My job is to understand why the Earth moves and how to stop it from wrecking things. Right then, the solid rock beneath my boots felt more stable than my entire life. I'd been on this remote survey for 10 days, a critical assessment, before the winter storms hit. Ellie, my wife, had apparently used that time to detonate our marriage. I read it again. Taken what's fair. The phrase snagged in my mind, a loose rock in a scree slope, dangerous. I didn't reply immediately. I had a job to do. So I finished my readings, cross-checked the data logger, packed up my gear. My movements were precise, economical, the way they always were in the field. Inside, a fault line had just ripped open. It wasn't until I was back at the base camp trailer that night, after reviewing the day's survey data and filing my initial report, that I finally typed a single-word response, understood. Then I shut off the phone. Kenji, my lead tech, who'd been with me for 6 years, glanced over from his laptop. "Everything all right, Mike?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Yeah," I said. "Just some static from home." He nodded, then went back to his own work. Engineers, like soldiers, often recognize when not to push. The truth was, this wasn't a seismic shock out of a clear blue sky. There had been tremors, precursor events I'd noted, but perhaps foolishly hadn't fully analyzed for their destructive potential. For the last year, Ellie had changed. She'd quit her part-time job at the art gallery, unfulfilling. She'd called it and become obsessed with becoming a lifestyle influencer. This involved an endless stream of new clothes, new gadgets, and attending exclusive seminars run by a charismatic online guru named Julian Vance. He promised financial freedom through opaque, next-gen investment vehicles. Ellie started parroting his jargon, talking about disrupting traditional wealth and leveraging personal brands. She began to view our carefully built, conservative investment portfolio as stagnant and boring. She made comments about my salary, once a point of pride and security for us, as merely functional. There were new, secretive friends, hush phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, and a sudden, intense interest in our joint finances, specifically how liquid they were. I'm a cautious man by nature and profession. My work involves anticipating worst-case scenarios: ground failure, structural collapse. That mindset extends to my personal life. Years ago, after a close call on a project where data was nearly lost, I developed a habit of meticulous digital archiving. All important documents, personal, financial, legal, were scanned, encrypted, and backed up on a drive I kept in my office safe. I also maintained a separate emergency bank account, a stability fund, that Ellie wasn't aware of, a contingency plan. It wasn't that I expected betrayal, it was just prudent risk management. The night before I left for this survey, Ellie had hugged me at the door. "Be safe," she'd said, her eyes already distant, probably calculating the follower count on her latest Instagram post. I should have seen the fissure widening then. I chose to believe it was just stress. I was wrong. What she didn't grasp was that my profession had trained me to meticulously investigate structural failures, not just mourn them. And I always finished my analysis. We met at a university fundraiser. I was a junior engineer, intense and a bit awkward, presenting a poster on a new soil stabilization technique. Ellie was working for the Alumni Association, vibrant and funny, and seemed genuinely interested in my work, or at least, in my passion for it. She said she admired that I was building things that lasted, things that kept people safe. We married 2 years later. Her family was artistic, a little bohemian. Mine were all teachers and civil servants, practical and grounded. For years, it felt like a good balance. She used to joke that I was her rock, a compliment I cherished. We bought a modest house in a quiet Seattle suburb, renovated it room by room with our own hands. My work often involved long hours, sometimes remote fieldwork for weeks at a time, especially on critical infrastructure projects. Ellie initially understood, or said she did. She'd say, "Go save the world, honey, I'll keep the home fires burning." My parents passed within a few years of each other, leaving me a small inheritance. Nothing life-changing, but it allowed us to pay off the mortgage and establish a comfortable nest egg, which I managed through a trusted, conservative brokerage. The first visible cracks in our foundation appeared about 18 months ago. Ellie started attending Vance's online workshops. She began complaining that we weren't living up to our potential. That her friends, mostly new acquaintances from Vance's circle, were jetting off to Bali and monetizing their bliss, while we were stuck in a comfortable rut. She grew resentful of my field assignments, calling them absences, that held back her networking opportunities. When I tried to discuss our long-term financial plans, my focus on steady growth and risk aversion, she'd dismiss it. "Mike, you're so old-fashioned. Julian says the old rules don't apply anymore. It's about aggressive growth now." I suggested we meet with our actual financial advisor. She refused, saying he was part of the old guard and didn't understand modern wealth creation. Then came the subtle withdrawals from our joint checking account, small amounts at first, for influencer workshops or premium content subscriptions from Vance's platform. When I'd ask, she'd get defensive. "It's an investment in my future, Mike. You spend money on your professional development, don't you?" I'm not a confrontational person. My training is to gather data, analyze, and then act. My gut, that internal inclinometer that warns of instability, was screaming. So I started my own quiet survey, doubling down on backing up financial statements, monitoring our joint accounts more closely, all while maintaining an outward appearance of calm. I knew a pressure front was building. 10 days after that initial text, I was back in Seattle, sitting in my stuffy temporary office at the firm. Our home was no longer mine, apparently. I accessed my encrypted archive. For hours, I meticulously cross-referenced bank statements, investment portfolio activity, and Ellie's credit card bills against the calendar of her networking events and Vance's online activity. My engineer's mind, trained to identify minute discrepancies in vast datasets that signal underlying structural flaws, started picking up a disturbing pattern. It wasn't just random spending. It was a systematic siphoning. Large sums had been transferred from our joint brokerage account, not to Ellie's personal account, but to an LLC I'd never heard of, Vance Apex Holdings. The transfers were structured just below the automatic notification threshold, split into multiple transactions. Classic layering. My stomach clenched. This was more than an affair or an impulsive spouse. This was calculated. This was fraud. That night, I couldn't face the silence of the cheap motel I'd booked. I called Sarah Miller. We'd worked together years ago at an environmental engineering firm before she went to law school. She specialized in complex financial and property disputes, and she still understood how an engineer's mind worked. "Sarah, it's Mike Turner. I think I'm in serious trouble." I laid it out, facts and figures, no emotion, like presenting a site assessment report. She listened patiently. "Mike," she said, her voice sharp and focused, "this isn't just a messy divorce. This stinks of a deliberate scheme. That LLC, Vance Apex Holdings, I'll run a check first thing. In the meantime, change every password you have. Pull your credit reports. Assume everything shared is compromised." Her pragmatism was a lifeline. The next day, Sarah called back. "Okay, Vance Apex Holdings is a shell corporation. Registered agent is a mail drop service. But I found a link. One of the initial signatories on its formation documents has a prior connection to Julian Vance in a failed property scheme in Arizona a few years back. Red flag the size of Texas. While she was digging, I had been conducting my own forensic analysis. Ellie had, a few months prior, innocently asked me to review some investment prospectuses from Vance, saying she didn't understand the technicalities. I'd glanced at them, dismissed them as fluff, but I'd saved the PDFs. Now I examined their metadata. My experience with doctored site investigation reports made me look for digital fingerprints. Timestamps were off, document properties scrubbed, but some hidden comments in one PDF referenced an internal server name that, with a little searching, linked back to a known associate of Vance previously flagged for questionable investment advice. Small cracks, but they revealed a wider pattern of deception. The transfers from our brokerage account weren't authorized by me. Ellie had access, but withdrawals of that size needed dual online authentication or signed paper forms. The brokerage confirmed they had received electronically signed authorization forms for the transfers. My signature was on them, except it wasn't. It was a good forgery, but as an engineer who signs off on countless detailed drawings and reports, I know my signature. The angles were subtly wrong, the pressure points different. "She forged your e-signature, or had Vance do it," Sarah stated, her voice grim. "This elevates things significantly, Mike. Wire fraud, identity theft. This Julian Vance sounds like a predator, and Ellie's either his victim or his accomplice." The distinction, I realized, was starting to matter less to me than the fact that my life was being systematically deconstructed by their actions. A cold rage, precise and focused, began to displace the shock and hurt. This was no longer just about a failed marriage. It was about a calculated attack on my financial stability, my professional integrity, my name on forged documents, my entire life's work. My engineer's training kicked in, define the problem, analyze the failure mechanism, design a remediation strategy. The immediate goal wasn't emotional confrontation, it was asset recovery and accountability. Sarah and I worked through the night, compiling evidence, tracing fund movements. We discovered Ellie had also taken out a significant line of credit against ours, now formerly our home, again with a forged signature. Most of those funds had also vanished into Vance Apex Holdings. "He's bleeding you dry, Mike," Sarah said. "And he's probably convinced Ellie she's about to become a millionaire." I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like an engineer facing a complex structural challenge. My focus narrowed. This wasn't just about Ellie's betrayal. It was about Julian Vance. He was the unstable element, the source of the pressure. He needed to be neutralized. "What's our next step?" I asked Sarah. "Vance is arrogant," she mused. "He thinks he's smarter than everyone. Con like him usually overreach, especially if they think their mark is vulnerable or unaware. We need to give him an opportunity to expose himself further, something undeniable. The plan was audacious, relying on Vance's greed and Ellie's probable manipulation by him. I had an old, fairly substantial treasury bond, inherited from my grandfather, held in a separate account Vance wouldn't know about. It was maturing in a few months. Under Sarah's guidance, I drafted an email to Ellie. I kept it brief, feigning distress and confusion over the divorce and the finances. I mentioned almost as an aside that with everything happening, I was thinking of cashing in that old bond from Grandpa, early despite the penalty, because I needed access to funds. I checked my personal email, knowing Vance likely had Ellie forward sensitive communications. Sarah was blunt. If Vance gets a whiff of a substantial, accessible asset he hasn't touched yet, he won't be able to resist. He'll push Ellie or try to get to it himself. We made sure the fictional, for this part of the plan, online access portal for this bond was one we could monitor securely for any access attempts. 2 days later, the trap was sprung. An attempt was made to access the fictitiously vulnerable bond account using credentials that included a misspelling of my mother's maiden name, a common security question. The IP address of the attempting computer, not Ellie's home IP, but one traceable to a business center Vance was known to frequent. Crucially, the attempt was followed by an email to the bond holding company from an anonymized address, attaching a power of attorney document authorizing immediate liquidation of the bond to a new account, an account Sarah quickly traced back to another of Vance's shell companies. The POA document featured another passable, but definitely forged, version of my signature. Got him, Sarah said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. Attempted wire fraud using forged documents directly from an IP he uses. This is the smoking gun, Mike. The relief I felt was cold but immense. It was the feeling of a successful load test confirming a critical design. The structure of their deceit was about to collapse. With this undeniable evidence of ongoing fraud attempts, Sarah immediately filed ex-parte motions to freeze any known accounts associated with Vance Apex Holdings and the new shell company. She also filed criminal complaints with the State Attorney General's office and a report with the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center, IC3, given the interstate and digital nature of the fraud. The next day, I was at my motel when Ellie called, her voice tight with panic. Mike, what's going on? The bank just called. They said our joint accounts are frozen? Julian said. He said you're trying to ruin us. Ruin us? Ellie. I kept my voice level. Or ruin you and your associate Vance, who tried to liquidate my grandfather's bond yesterday. Silence on her end, then a choked sob. I don't know what you're talking about. The police might have a different view, Ellie, and the FBI. Forgery is a serious crime. So is wire fraud? I hung up. A few hours later, Sarah called. They're moving. The AG's office is taking this seriously. Apparently, Vance's name has popped up in a couple of other preliminary investigations in neighboring states. Your detailed evidence, Mike, especially the IP trace and the directly forged POA on the bond, it's golden. It links him directly to the criminal act, not just an association with Ellie. The feeling was complex, not triumph, not yet. More like the grim satisfaction an engineer feels when a potentially catastrophic design flaw has been identified and containment procedures are underway. Justice, like a stable foundation, is built on hard evidence. The following weeks were a blur of legal proceedings. The authorities, armed with our evidence, uncovered a wider network of Vance's operations. He was a serial predator, targeting individuals he perceived as financially comfortable but perhaps emotionally vulnerable or naive about complex investments. Ellie, it turned out, was one of several influencers he'd cultivated, some knowingly complicit in funneling investor money to him, others, like Ellie claimed to be, dazzled by his charm and promises, willingly blind to the red flags. She maintained she was mostly a pawn, manipulated by Vance's expertise and charisma, convinced Mike was hiding assets from her. Sarah pragmatically negotiated a settlement. In exchange for Ellie's full cooperation against Vance, including an affidavit detailing his methods of persuasion and control over their joint finances, and her relinquishing any and all claims to my separate property, my pension, and agreeing to the swift annulment of the line of credit taken out against the house via forgery. I wouldn't pursue separate criminal charges against her for the forgeries she committed under his direction. She had to return what little remained of the funds in accounts she solely controlled. The house, which I no longer wanted, was to be sold, with proceeds after repaying the fraudulently obtained line of credit split according to premarital assets and a minimal agreed-upon sum for her, enough for her to start over, but far from the windfall she'd been promised by Vance. The divorce was finalized quickly. Vance, facing multiple federal charges and overwhelming evidence from several victims, including irrefutable digital trails I'd helped uncover, eventually took a plea deal. He was sentenced to a significant prison term. The day the divorce was final, I stood in the empty house for the last time before the new owners took possession. It was just a shell, filled with ghosts of a life that wasn't real anymore. I didn't feel sadness, just a profound sense of closure, like decommissioning an unstable structure. I took a sabbatical from my firm. I needed to be somewhere the ground felt truly solid beneath my feet again. I ended up in Montana buying a small, slightly dilapidated cabin on several acres bordering national forest. I spent months physically working on it, new foundation supports, reframing walls, fixing the roof. The smell of sawdust and fresh earth was cleansing. I started doing some consulting for local conservation groups, assessing land stability for trail building and small-scale community projects. The work was tangible, the results immediate and appreciated. One evening, a year later, I received a letter forwarded from Sarah's office. It was from a retired couple in Oregon. They'd been another of Vance's targets, nearly losing their entire life savings. The letter explained that the detailed evidence from my case, the meticulous way I documented the digital forgeries and traced the initial fund diversions, had been instrumental in the FBI's ability to build a comprehensive case against Vance and recover a significant portion of the stolen assets for multiple victims. "You don't know us, Mr. Turner," it read, "but your courage and diligence in fighting back saved us. You didn't just reclaim what was yours, you helped protect others. Thank you." I pinned the letter to the rough-hewn wooden wall of my cabin. Sometimes, in the quiet of the mountains, the silence could still feel vast. But now, it wasn't empty. It was filled with the understanding that even when the ground beneath you crumbles, you can analyze the failure, design a new foundation, and build something stronger, something true. My work had always been about preventing collapses. This time, I just had to rebuild from one of my own. And in doing so, perhaps I'd inadvertently reinforced more than just my own life. The earth here felt solid, and for the first time in a long time, so did I.